The betrayal wasn't the mistress. The betrayal was the certainty in his eyes that I would fail without him. When I signed the papers resigning from the transportation company where I had worked for 10 years, I never imagined that would be the beginning of the darkest, yet most defining chapter of my life. My ex-husband, Brian Walker, had always been a proud man, used to everything revolving around him. He was the owner, the CEO, and the self-proclaimed genius behind Walker Logistics, a regional trucking and freight company. That afternoon, the smell of cheap lilac perfume hit me the moment I opened the front door. The house was usually quiet, smelling faintly of lemon polish and Brian's expensive cologne. But this smell, sweet, cloying, and utterly foreign, was the first punch. I walked into the living room and the world fractured. Brian was on our cream-colored leather couch, not alone. He was kissing Lily, a woman easily 15 years younger than me, whose glossy dark hair was draped over the cushion where I usually read. I stood in the entryway, the sound of the car keys dropping onto the hardwood floor echoing the sharp, metallic snap of my sanity breaking. Brian didn't even bother to pull away immediately. He looked over Lily's shoulder, his expression bored, impatient, the look he usually reserved for a slow delivery driver. "Well, Sarah." "Good timing," he said, finally pushing Lily away. Lily giggled, a sound that felt like glass shattering inside my chest, and she pulled a silk robe tighter around herself. I was paralyzed. My son James, just 8 years old, was playing with his Legos in his room, blissfully unaware of the silent catastrophe unfolding 10 feet away. "Brian, what is this?" I managed, my voice a dry whisper. He stood up, tall and heavy, smoothing down his expensive linen shirt. "This is the future, Sarah. Doesn't involve you. You and your son are leaving today. Pack your bags." I couldn't breathe. The reality was too brutal, too fast. I tried to reason with him, to appeal to the 4 years we'd built this life, the 8 years we'd raised James. That's when he exploded. Not with tears or regret, but with the cold, calculated venom of a predator securing his territory. "Stop, Sarah, I'm done. I don't want your dull routine, and I don't need your slow ideas at the company anymore. You're a liability now. Without me, you and your son will die of hunger. You're good for nothing, Sarah." Those words struck me like a knife. Die of hunger. He wasn't just throwing me out, he was issuing a prophecy, a curse. I saw myself suddenly, with my son, 2 suitcases, and no income. The resignation I had signed 3 weeks ago, a resignation Brian had insisted upon, claiming he wanted me to focus on home and myself, now that the company was stabilized, suddenly felt like the final, devastating piece of a meticulously planned trap. For the first time in years, I felt real, debilitating fear. That night, we slept on my sister Maria's pull-out couch. Maria, God bless her soul, was a practical, kind soul who didn't ask questions until the morning. But the couch was thin, the springs dug into my back, and the knowledge of my total failure was a suffocating blanket. James, my sweet, perceptive boy, sensed the shift. He asked why we couldn't go home. "Did I do something wrong, Mom?" he asked, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. I pulled him close, burying my face in his hair, which smelled like bubblegum shampoo. "No, baby, never. Mom just needs to find us a new home. A better one." I didn't know how to answer without breaking down, so I hugged him until the question went away. The next few weeks were a descent into the reality Brian had prophesied. I had a small savings account, enough for a month's rent, but nothing more. My primary asset, my 10 years of institutional knowledge at Walker Logistics, was now worthless on the open market because I had signed a non-compete clause upon my resignation, a clause I now realized was designed not to protect company secrets, but to financially disable me. I took on any temporary job I could find. I cleaned offices after midnight, the scent of industrial cleaner burning my sinuses. I handed out promotional flyers downtown, my feet throbbing on the cold cement. I took care of an elderly woman who needed help running errands, all while James went to school, unaware that his mother cried in silence every night on a borrowed couch, calculating exactly how many hours of office cleaning equaled 1 week of groceries. But a spark of determination ignited inside me. It wasn't the heat of anger, it was the steady, burning wick of necessity. Brian's words, "You and your son will die of hunger," didn't just wound me, they became the mission statement of my new life. I had to prove him wrong, not for revenge, but for James's right to eat, to learn, and to feel safe. I had always had a natural talent for logistics and organization. For years, I had been Brian's right-hand woman, the one who actually designed the optimized delivery routes, managed the vendor contracts, and streamlined the inventory flow. Brian managed the big, loud contracts. I managed the small, crucial details that made the company profitable. With the remainder of my savings, I enrolled in an intensive online business management course, focusing specifically on supply chain optimization. I leveraged the small network I had, not Brian's wealthy friends, but the practical, hard-working vendor managers and fleet dispatchers I knew from years on the phones. I made a plan, opened a small consulting business from Maria's cramped dining table, and worked relentlessly. I called the business Apex Strategy. The first few weeks were hell, fueled only by cheap coffee and pure fear, but soon a small, local manufacturing client, struggling with their delivery schedules, trusted me. Then another, and another. My ideas worked. My reputation grew swiftly because I solved problems Brian's company, now run by Brian and presumably Lily, was too arrogant to even see. Within less than a year, my consulting firm, Apex Strategy, was advising several mid-sized companies in the same regional transportation industry as Walker Logistics. That's when I discovered something that took my breath away. Brian's corporation, Walker Logistics, was nearly bankrupt, and a unique opportunity was about to fall into my hands. Part 2 of the script, Normal Life/Setup, and the first clue, ~1000 words, the shock of the abandonment began to fade, replaced by a cold, grinding necessity. But to understand the full weight of Brian's curse, you and your son will die of hunger. You need to understand the life he had systematically built around my dependence. Our life, before the lilac perfume and the locked door, was deceptively comfortable. Brian and I had met in college. He was the ambitious, loud-talking business major. I was the quiet, detail-oriented student who organized his notes and kept his chaos manageable. When he started Walker Logistics right out of school, I was his uncredited co-founder. I was the one who worked the phones, tracked the inventory, and built the internal scheduling systems that ensured their profit margins. I wasn't officially the CEO or even the vice president. My title for 10 years was Executive Assistant and Logistics Coordinator. It sounded modest, but I was the engine of the operation. Brian was the flashy hood ornament, always securing the big contracts with his bravado, then tossing the execution to me. "You're the brains, Sarah," he'd often say, leaning back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "I'm the face, and faces get paid more." I accepted this arrangement because I believed we were a team. We had the comfortable 4-bedroom house, the 2 reliable cars, and James, our beautiful, active boy. I handled the domestic logistics with the same efficiency I handled the trucks. Meals were planned, school events were scheduled, and the mortgage was paid on time. My greatest weakness was that I had allowed my financial identity to become completely fused with Brian's. My income was deposited into the joint account, but Brian managed the investments and the savings. My resignation 3 weeks prior, which he had framed as a well-deserved break for the most competent woman I know, had effectively cut my legal access to the company and dried up my income stream. He had made me a housewife just long enough to execute his final trap. The first hint that his betrayal went deeper than infidelity came 6 months before the abandonment, but I was too blind, too trusting, to see it. It started with the company. Walker Logistics had always been stable, but suddenly the atmosphere grew tense. Brian started coming home late, smelling of stress, not just scotch. "What's wrong, honey?" I'd ask, offering him the calm of our kitchen. "Nothing you'd understand, Sarah," he'd snap. "Logistics are getting complicated. Fuel costs, new regulations, stupid, slow competitors." The first clue was subtle, tied to the company's fleet. Walker Logistics specialized in refrigerated transport, a high-margin business. Brian suddenly ordered the massive, premature sale of 5 of our newest, most valuable refrigerated trucks. "Why the sale, Brian?" I asked in the office, standing over the ledger. "They were barely a year old. That's a huge depreciation hit." He looked up at me, his eyes cold and hard the way he looked at a rival. "It's strategic restructuring. We're outsourcing the cold freight to a third party temporarily. It saves on maintenance and insurance right now. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." I hesitated. I knew the numbers didn't make sense. Outsourcing cold freight was cripplingly expensive and risked our reputation for reliability. But Brian had hired a new, slick financial advisor, Marcus, whom he constantly deferred to. "Marcus said it's the smart play," Brian insisted, seeing my doubt. "We need to free up capital quickly. Just trust the experts, Sarah. You're done with the numbers now, remember? Just focus on James." I swallowed my intuition. That was the essence of the trap. Whenever I questioned him on his company, he redirected me to the safety of home, flattering me while undermining my professional confidence. I told myself it was just male ego, not malice. But the real clue, the one that should have screamed, came 2 weeks later. I noticed a small, barely perceptible change in Brian's voice when he talked on the phone. Whenever he spoke to Marcus, the financial advisor, or to certain new contacts, he began using a strange, coded language. He would refer to cash flow not as cash flow, but as the snow. Large debt restructuring deals were called the iceberg. Did Marcus settle the snow? He'd whisper into his phone late at night. We need to melt the iceberg before the quarterly. I found myself pausing, confused. Why the secrecy? Why the ridiculous codes for standard business transactions? One evening, I found a printout of an email crumpled in the recycling bin. It was a communication between Brian and Marcus. The subject line was innocuous, but the body contained a crucial line. We need to offload more of the heavy assets before the divorce proceedings are finalized. If Sarah sees the true valuation, she'll cripple the buyout. My blood went cold. He wasn't planning a divorce, he was planning a betrayal and dispossession. He was deliberately suppressing the company's real value by selling off key assets, like the expensive refrigerated trucks, to lower the total marital estate, making his eventual buyout of my share worthless. But even then, the scale of his cruelty, the planned abandonment on the street, was unimaginable. I thought, he's just trying to cheat me out of a few $100,000 in the divorce. I never suspected he planned to strip me bare and use his affair as the executioner's final blow, leaving me with nothing but a prophecy of failure. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I was too afraid to alert him that I knew his game. I silently began gathering my small amount of personal money, preparing for a nasty legal fight, a fight I thought would take place in a lawyer's office, not on a cold street corner. That was my mistake. I underestimated the depth of his arrogance and the final, brutal efficiency of his exit strategy. The day I found the crumpled email about crippling the buyout was the day I stopped being a wife and became a strategist. I knew a divorce was coming, and I knew Brian intended to use his corporate maneuvering to leave me with peanuts. I scheduled an appointment with a top litigation lawyer to secure my intellectual property rights and formally challenge the non-compete clause. But I was too slow. Brian wasn't waiting for a civilized legal battle, he was planning an execution. I spent that day away from the house, meeting with the attorney. I showed him the coded emails, the ledger showing the premature sale of the refrigerated trucks, and the termination papers I had signed. The attorney confirmed my worst fear. Brian was hiding assets, but proving it would take months of forensic accounting. He advised me to go home, act normal, and slowly begin moving my personal belongings out. I returned to the house around 4:30, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. I felt a surge of cold determination. I was ready to play the game of quiet warfare, to be the dutiful wife for a few weeks while I emptied the personal savings account and documented his deceit. I opened the door, and the familiar, nauseating scent of that lilac perfume was overwhelming. It wasn't just a lingering smell, it was fresh. I walked into the living room and there they were again, but this time the scene was different. Lily wasn't just lounging, she was placing framed photos of me and James face down on the mantel. She was claiming territory. When they saw me, there was no surprise, no hurried separation. Brian was sitting on the couch, drinking a beer, looking utterly relaxed. Lily, wearing my plush white bathrobe, the one James gave me for Mother's Day, was holding a large designer travel bag. Perfect, Brian sighed without getting up. He signaled to Lily with his chin. Go pack the rest of your things, Lilybug. Pack what? I asked, my voice rising in a tight, panicked squeak. Your things, Brian repeated, his tone flat. We're done, you're leaving today. Leaving? Brian, we can talk about a separation, we can talk to lawyers, but you can't just throw me out. This is my home. He set the beer down with a deliberate thud, finally standing. He didn't come close. He stood near the staircase, framing his exit. It's my house, Sarah. I own the company. I pay the mortgage. You resigned. You have no income, no equity, and a non-compete clause that makes you useless. Lily and I are starting our life now. Yours is over here. My world was spinning. James is upstairs. You can't do this to your son. His face hardened, the mask of the proud businessman replacing the mask of the loving husband. James is welcome to visit when you get a stable address. But he can't stay with a woman who has no means of support. Think about the optics, Sarah. You're unemployed. I'm the CEO. I can petition for full custody based on your current unemployment. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the monster underneath the tailored suit. It wasn't about love or Lily, it was about power and leverage. He was using his financial control to eliminate me completely, both as a wife and as a co-parent. "You are going to regret this, Brian," I warned, shaking, trying to hold onto the dignity I knew I was rapidly losing. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and stepped toward the front door, pulling his wallet out. He grabbed a handful of crumpled bills, about $400, and threw them onto the floor at my feet. The money scattered near my worn leather work bag. "There. That's your settlement," he sneered. "Go get a cheap motel room. Without me, you and your son will die of hunger. You're good for nothing, Sarah. Now get out of my house." Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling, holding 2 expensive suitcases, wearing a little too much of my jewelry. The sight of her, wearing my things in my house, was the final pinprick that burst my emotional dam. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I was filled with a cold, terrifying clarity. I looked down at the humiliating scatter of cash, then up at the smug arrogance of their faces, and I made a silent vow. "Fine," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet vibrating with a force I didn't know I possessed. "We're leaving, but keep the money, Brian. I don't need your blood money, and I will never need you again." I left the cash on the floor. The only thing I picked up was my dignity, which felt paper thin and highly threatened. I walked upstairs, my legs heavy, the smell of lilac and betrayal clinging to the air. I went into James's room. He was building an elaborate tower. "Hey, buddy," I said, my voice falsely bright. "We're going on an adventure. We need to pack 2 bags. We're going to stay with Aunt Maria for a while." James was confused but trusted me completely. We packed quickly, his favorite dinosaur, a few worn shirts, and his homework. While James was focused, I slipped 2 items into my work bag. My old company laptop, which I had forgotten to return after my resignation, and a spare set of physical ledger backups from 2018 I kept locked in my filing cabinet for tax audit purposes, just a mechanical habit from my time as the logistics coordinator. We walked out of the house 40 minutes later. James clutching his dinosaur, me dragging 2 suitcases, my old work bag clutched to my chest. Lily was standing in the doorway, blocking the sun, a triumphant shadow. As we walked down the driveway toward the street, toward the unknown, I heard Brian slam the door shut behind us. The sound was definitive, a final period on a terrible chapter. The street was chillier than the house. James looked back once, his small face etched with confusion. "Mom, why is that lady in your robe?" "Don't worry about her, James," I said, pulling him close, focusing on the rhythmic sound of his small feet hitting the pavement. "We're going to build something new, something real." We made it to Maria's house, exhausted and smelling of the cold street. Lying on that thin, springy pull-out couch later that night, with James sleeping soundly beside me, I realized the full devastation of my situation. I had no job, no money, no home, and a son depending on me. Brian had left me with a debt greater than any bank loan, the debt of his prophecy. But in the quiet darkness, with the tremor finally leaving my hands, a different emotion began to surface. It wasn't grief anymore. It was a cold, hard, crystalline rage, sharpened by his arrogance. "You think I'll die of hunger?" I thought, looking up at Maria's ceiling fan spinning slowly. "You just unlocked the most dangerous woman you've ever met." The old, compliant Sarah was gone. In her place was a focused, relentless machine driven by the need to secure James's future and deliver perfect justice. The early days of rebuilding were characterized by 2 things: the smell of industrial-strength ammonia from the late-night offices I cleaned, and the sheer, focused clarity of my mind. There was no room for self-pity, only for logistics. I treated our survival like a complex, high-stakes supply chain problem that had to be solved. My sister Maria was my first, most critical resource. She handled James, shielding him from the fear while I worked. With the little savings I had, I secured a tiny, windowless office space above a dry cleaner. The rent was cheap, and the faint, clean smell of chemicals was preferable to the scent of Lily's perfume. My reaction to Brian's cruelty wasn't emotional revenge, it was strategic re-entry. I needed to get back into the transportation industry, but the non-compete clause was a legal landmine. I pulled out my old company laptop, which still had access to generic vendor specifications and industry white papers. More importantly, I pulled out the dusty 2018 physical ledger backups I had instinctively grabbed. They were 3 years old, but they contained the original, uninflated, unmanipulated cost of goods and operational efficiency metrics I had personally designed. They were the key to understanding how Walker Logistics actually made money before Brian started messing with the assets. The ledger confirmed everything. Brian's cost-cutting measures weren't strategic, they were sloppy. He had sacrificed long-term efficiency for short-term, asset-hiding gains. His business was relying on expensive, temporary third-party contracts and high-interest loans to appear liquid for the divorce, masking a core operational rot. My first action was to create Apex Strategy. I branded myself not as a competing logistics firm, but as an operational efficiency consultant. This skirted the non-compete clause. I wasn't moving freight. I was advising clients on how to move freight better. I started small. My first client was a local organic produce distributor struggling with last-mile refrigerated delivery costs, exactly the area Brian had abandoned. I spent 3 weeks in my tiny, dry cleaner-scented office, dissecting the distributor's problems. I used my deep internal knowledge of regional routes, vendor contract negotiation, and optimal refrigeration cycles. I knew that small delays cost huge money, and the key was predictive scheduling, not brute force trucking. When I presented my findings, the distributor's owner, a kind, practical woman named Alina, was stunned. "Sarah," Alina said, reviewing my dense, concise report, "your solutions are cutting our monthly fuel and third-party refrigeration costs by nearly 18%. How do you know this industry so intimately?" "Because I built the systems for the biggest name in regional transport for 10 years, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. I never named Brian or the company, maintaining a professional distance. I know where the hidden inefficiencies live. Alina became my first loyal advocate. She didn't just pay me, she became my ambassador, referring me to other businesses in the regional manufacturing and distribution network. This network, I quickly realized, was completely disillusioned with the established, arrogant firms like Walker Logistics. My reputation wasn't built on flash, it was built on results. My fees were reasonable, and my solutions were precise. I worked relentless hours, fueled by the memory of Brian's smug face and the need to get James off Maria's couch. One evening, nearly 8 months after the abandonment, I was working in my office. James was finally asleep in our own small, rented apartment, a modest place, but one with its own clean, honest smell. The phone rang. It was a major manufacturing client I had been courting, Northern Industries. They had a massive, complex contract coming up, and their current logistics provider had suddenly become unreliable. "We've heard you're the only person who can truly optimize complex cold chain routes," the Northern Industries VP told me. "Our current carrier, Walker Logistics, is failing. Their dispatch is a mess, and we're losing too much inventory on the road. We need a 6-month strategy review starting immediately." My breath hitched. Walker Logistics, Brian's company. "I can take that contract," I said, my voice perfectly level. "My rates are firm, and my results are guaranteed." This contract wasn't just money, it was my Trojan horse. It allowed me to legally access the operational metrics and performance data of Brian's core business without violating the non-compete. I could analyze his company's decline from the perspective of their most powerful client. I took the job. I spent the next few weeks submerged in Walker Logistics' operational failures. The data confirmed my suspicion. Since I left, their key performance indicators, KPIs, had plummeted. Their dispatch was chaotic, their fuel usage was inefficient, and their maintenance costs were skyrocketing because the complex systems I had built were collapsing without my meticulous oversight. Brian and Lily were busy securing the iceberg and the snow, leaving the engine of the business to seize up. Brian, focused on his large, showy contracts, was too arrogant to realize that the operational reports being sent to Northern Industries, reports I was now analyzing, were screaming failure. The realization came in 3 parts, sharp and cold. Brian was not the genius, I was. His success was entirely dependent on my systems. Lily was no replacement. The administrative failures were tied directly to the tasks I used to manage. The company was functionally insolvent. It was covering massive operational losses by selling off assets, which only accelerated the rot. I realized then that Brian's prophecy, "Without me, you and your son will die of hunger," was never a curse aimed at me. It was a projection of his own deepest, most crippling fear. Without me, Brian Walker would starve, and I was now in a legal position, as the confidential consultant to his largest client, to watch him do it. The game wasn't over. It was about to enter the most strategic phase of my life. The contract with Northern Industries was not just a job, It was my legal window into Brian's failure. For 3 months, I worked side by side with Northern's operations team, documenting every missed delivery, every fuel overage, and every chaotic dispatch report coming from Walker Logistics. I maintained absolute professional silence, never revealing my history with Brian, but the data was screaming the truth. Brian was hemorrhaging cash, and his company was sinking fast. The core problem was exactly what I had warned him about years ago: liquidity combined with operational inefficiency. He had leveraged the company heavily for personal investments, which I suspected were now benefiting Lily, sold off core profitable assets, the refrigerated trucks, and then tried to cover the resulting chaos by taking out exorbitant short-term loans. The first public consequence, the one that truly shook Brian's reputation, was entirely organic. Northern Industries, using my meticulously compiled data, issued a public, formal breach of contract notice to Walker Logistics. Northern Industries was Brian's anchor client, accounting for nearly 40% of his gross revenue. The loss was catastrophic. Brian, unable to understand that the systems he inherited were failing, publicly blamed Northern Industries for unreasonable demands and vendor malice. This arrogant reaction only solidified my reputation with other local manufacturers who had watched the messy fallout. That was the turning point. When Northern Industries abruptly pulled their contract, the stock of Walker Logistics, which was privately held but had been partially funded through several regional investment firms, began to be quietly shopped around. Brian, desperate to plug the massive hole in his balance sheet, needed cash fast. That's when the opportunity revealed itself, cold and clear as a winter morning. Northern Industries, reeling from the sudden gap in their supply chain, was looking for an immediate replacement logistics provider. I presented my final, comprehensive report, detailing exactly why Walker Logistics failed and outlining the infrastructure needed for a new, reliable regional carrier. "Sarah," the Northern VP, Mr. Henderson, said, leaning back in his chair, "we don't just need a consultant, we need the solution. We need a carrier that runs exactly on the models you designed. Can you start a new logistics company and manage our freight?" "I can," I replied, "but starting from zero takes time and capital. The fastest, most efficient solution is to acquire an existing fleet and integrate my system. Walker Logistics is already in liquidation talks. They have the assets, trucks, warehouses, but they don't have the mind to run them." Mr. Henderson looked thoughtful. "Acquisition? It would be messy, but fast. Brian Walker is sinking, but he is still a shark." "He's a drowning shark," I corrected gently, "and he's selling off pieces of the boat to stay afloat. He is desperate for a buyer who will assume his debt load and get him cash without forcing a humiliating public bankruptcy." I presented my bold strategy, the hostile rescue. I had already quietly incorporated a shell company, Apex Holdings. I spent the next 2 weeks meeting with the same regional investment firms Brian had alienated, presenting them with 2 things: my impeccable track record with Northern Industries and the cold, hard, historical operational data from my old 2018 ledgers, proving that Walker Logistics was inherently profitable, if run by me, and without Brian's reckless spending and asset stripping. The investors didn't care about justice, they cared about return on investment. They saw the undeniable potential of the company under my management and the low acquisition cost due to Brian's desperation. Within 4 weeks, Apex Holdings, backed by the regional investors, had secured a position to buy up the distressed debt of Walker Logistics. This was a critical step. By buying the debt, we gained massive leverage over the company's ownership. Brian didn't know I was the mastermind behind Apex Holdings. He thought he was dealing with faceless corporate vultures. His financial advisor, Marcus, who was likely covering up his own complicity, was frantically coordinating the sale. The final negotiation meeting was scheduled for the following month. Brian, thinking he was selling the company to a private equity firm, believed he was finally escaping his debt and securing his cash windfall. Meanwhile, my personal life was steadily stabilizing. James was thriving in his new school, and I had managed to pay Maria back, moving us into a modest but secure 2-bedroom apartment. Every night, after the books were balanced and the strategy refined, I would sit with James and read. This routine, simple and unburdened by Brian's toxic presence, was my fuel. My motivation was no longer revenge, it was prevention. Brian's curse, "You and your son will die of hunger," had to be dismantled permanently. Acquiring his company wasn't about spite, it was about securing the economic landscape for James's future. It was about controlling the industry narrative so that no one ever again could dismiss my competence. The day of the final negotiation, I wore a perfectly tailored suit, the first I had bought with my own honest, hard-earned consulting money. I drove to the high-rise downtown where the transaction was to take place. I walked into the massive, glass-walled boardroom. The table was lined with stern-faced bankers and nervous-looking legal teams. Brian was already there, flanked by Marcus, the financial advisor. Brian was pacing, arrogant even in his impending defeat. He looked up as I entered the room. His mouth opened to make some loud, self-aggrandizing joke to the investors, but the words died in his throat. He saw me, Sarah, his ex-wife. The good-for-nothing woman who was supposed to be cleaning toilets and begging for alimony. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I walked to the head of the table where the lead investor stood, and he pulled out the chair for me. Brian stammered, his face draining of color. Sarah, what are you doing here? You're not authorized. I simply opened my briefcase and placed the signed documents on the table. Mr. Walker, I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, cutting through the silence of the room. I am here as the Chief Operations Strategist for Apex Holdings. As of this morning, Apex has successfully consolidated the majority equity interest and the secured debt of Walker Logistics, which means, legally, I am now sitting in the majority position. I looked directly at Brian, whose eyes were wide and terrified. You wanted to know who bought your company, Brian? You're looking at her. I am now the largest shareholder of your corporation. The final consequence, the definitive financial dismantling of his arrogance, was about to begin. The man who tried to leave me with nothing was about to learn the true cost of underestimating the silent partner. The silence in the boardroom after my announcement was thick enough to suffocate in. Brian's face, usually ruddy with arrogance, was the color of weak tea. He wasn't just surprised, he was physically destabilized. You can't, he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the documents on the table. You signed a non-compete, you have no capital. This is illegal, Sarah. I looked at him calmly, the years of silent planning culminating in this one, clear moment. I signed a non-compete, Brian, that prevented me from moving freight. It said nothing about consulting on how to move freight or about acquiring distressed assets. And my capital came from investors who saw the immense profit potential in the Apex strategy, a potential that was being crippled by your gross financial mismanagement and operational failures. I picked up the final document, the new Articles of Incorporation. I've been legally advised, Brian. As of 9 a.m. this morning, through Apex Holdings, I control 51% of your equity. You, Mr. Walker, are now a minority shareholder reporting to the board, which I now chair. The lead investor from Northern Industries, Mr. Henderson, stepped forward, his expression formal and severe. Mr. Walker, the purpose of this meeting is not a confrontation, it is a transition. Your actions have jeopardized millions in regional freight contracts. Ms. Walker has provided irrefutable data showing the company's core operational system, which she designed, was sabotaged by your panic-driven asset stripping. We are invoking the emergency clause to protect our investment and prevent a public collapse. The reality hit Brian. I hadn't just sued him, I had strategically acquired him. His control fractured. He didn't rage at me, he turned on the one person he still thought he could command, Marcus, the financial advisor. Marcus, why didn't you stop this? You said the debt structuring was solid. Marcus was sweating, clearly aware that his own reputation was now dust. We didn't anticipate Ms. Walker would have access to the historic operational data, Brian. We couldn't predict a hostile rescue of this magnitude. This was entirely legal. Brian collapsed into his chair, looking instantly older, smaller. The man who had thrown his wife and son out with the curse of die of hunger was now facing his ultimate starvation, the loss of his identity. The public consequence was immediate and brutal. Walker Logistics was a mid-sized, prominent company in the regional transportation sector. The news, leaked by Mr. Henderson's firm as a show of stability, wasn't just that the company was sold. It was that the CEO was ousted by his ex-wife, who was previously dismissed as a mere assistant. The story spread like wildfire through the industry journals and local business circles. The narrative was perfect. The arrogant, cheating CEO runs the business into the ground while his competent, loyal wife, whom he discarded for a mistress, rises from nothing to execute a brilliant, clean takeover. His social standing evaporated. The loud praise, the backslapping camaraderie he thrived on, it all turned into cold, professional silence. Business leaders who had laughed with him at golf outings now saw him as a financial incompetent and a moral reprobate. And what about Lily? The ultimate prize Brian had sought to secure his happiness? I didn't have to seek her out. She disappeared from the company offices within 48 hours. Lily wasn't interested in the man who was now a minority, bankrupt shareholder with a collapsed reputation. She was interested in the CEO of Walker Logistics. When the CEO title transferred to me, Lily's interest evaporated with the same speed as Brian's assets. I heard through Maria that Lily was seen moving her expensive luggage out of our old house and into a small condo, leaving Brian to deal with the inevitable foreclosure. The luxury and status she bought with her cheap perfume dissolved, leaving Brian entirely alone, stripped of his fortune, his reputation, and his emotional buffer. My first action as the majority shareholder and acting CEO was not vindictive, but clinical. I immediately initiated a massive operational audit of Walker Logistics. I didn't fire Brian, that would have given him grounds for a public fight and made him a martyr. Instead, I gave him a choice. I called him into my new, expansive office, the office that used to be his. The air smelled of clean linen and new beginnings, not scotch or lilac. "Brian," I said, leaning over the dark mahogany desk, "you are still a minority shareholder. The board has voted to retain your services on an interim advisory basis for the transition. Your title is Asset Liquidation Advisor." He stared at me, his eyes full of hatred. "You're humiliating me, I won't do it." "You will," I countered, my voice firm. "Because if you resign now, the board will officially label your departure termination for gross incompetence, which will impact your final, meager stock buyout. If you stay and advise on liquidation, you get a clean exit and the last check you will ever receive from this company. The choice is yours." He had no leverage left. The man who predicted I would starve was forced to take a job working for me, dismantling the very company he boasted he created. I didn't revel in the moment. I felt a deep, steady satisfaction. Justice wasn't revenge, it was the meticulous reversal of power. Brian had thrown me out onto the street with $400. I was now giving him a temporary contract to pay for his eventual retirement. The company was mine. The debt was mine. And the responsibility for James's future was, finally and securely, mine alone. Now, the real work of turning a sinking ship around could begin. The takeover was swift, but the true work was slow and meticulous. Walker Logistics was a sinking ship, not a treasure chest. I spent the next 6 months submerged in the minutiae of the business, applying the apex strategy principles I had honed on Maria's dining table. I immediately purged the corruption, starting with Marcus. The financial advisor was dismissed and faced his own quiet professional ruin. Then I focused on the core operations. I stopped the desperate, short-term contract deals Brian had signed, brought back a stable maintenance schedule for the existing fleet, and most importantly, I rehired the experienced, loyal dispatchers Brian had fired in favor of cheaper, less competent staff. I brought back the integrity of the system. The company was officially rebranded as Apex Logistics. The name wasn't just about strategy. It was a constant, internal reminder of the summit I had climbed from the lowest valley of my life. My final, definitive interaction with Brian came 6 months after the takeover, when his contract as Asset Liquidation Advisor ended. He walked into my office one last time, holding a small box of personal items. He looked defeated, his suit ill-fitting, the old arrogant sheen completely gone. "The final audit report is on your desk," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "The debt is stabilized. The company is yours, Sarah. You won." He still saw it as a game, a zero-sum competition. "I didn't win, Brian," I said, my voice calm, signing a routine document. "I fixed it. This was never a game. It was a failure of management, a failure of ethics, and a failure of character on your part. I simply cleaned up the debris." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He tried one last flicker of the old charisma, the old venom. "Lily left me, you know. She took the car. I ended up with nothing." I looked up, not with satisfaction, but with the cool indifference one reserves for a distant weather report. "That's unfortunate, Brian, but your personal consequences are no longer my concern. My concern is Apex Logistics and the future of my son. Goodbye, Brian." He left without another word. The door clicked shut, and I felt a heavy psychological weight lift off my shoulders. The ghost of his prophecy, "You and your son will die of hunger," was finally and definitively exorcised from my world. With the company stabilized and profitable again, I finally allowed myself to focus on healing the home. I sold the tiny apartment and bought a modest, quiet house in a good school district. It wasn't the mansion Brian had bought with company money, but it was structurally sound, bathed in natural light, and the mortgage was entirely, cleanly mine. The sensory details of that house were my therapy. The smell of the freshly mowed grass in the evening, the sound of James's laughter echoing in his own, permanent room, the warmth of the sun on my face as I sat on the porch, not pounding on a locked door, but simply existing. My relationship with money shifted profoundly. I was wealthy now, a successful CEO and largest shareholder of a thriving company, but wealth was no longer about status or luxury. It was about security and impact. I used my wealth to create a bulletproof financial fortress for James, but I also used it to reward the loyalty Brian had ignored. I instituted profit-sharing programs and raised the wages of every single driver and dispatcher, recognizing that the true strength of a logistics company lies in the hands of the people who execute the plan. I ensured that every person working at Apex Logistics felt respected and financially secure. The moral closure was realizing that the act of building was far more satisfying than the act of revenge. I had built a legacy for my son, demonstrated my self-worth to myself, and created a positive structure where Brian had created only chaos. The quiet nights were my greatest luxury. I was no longer crying into a borrowed pillow, nor was I plotting. I was reading a book or helping James with his homework, the sound of the ticking clock a comforting reminder of time well spent. I didn't forgive Brian. Forgiveness, in that context, felt unnecessary and undeserved. I simply released him. He was a closed chapter, a historical footnote in the much grander story of my own resilience. His failure was complete and my ascent was just beginning. The woman who was good for nothing was now employing hundreds and managing millions. The true victory wasn't the company, it was the unshakable knowledge that I had been and always would be enough. The greatest realization I had in the years following the acquisition was that Brian's cruelest words, "You're good for nothing, Sarah," were not a curse aimed at me, but a mirror reflecting his own deepest insecurity. He had always confused status with value. His value was external, the size of his office, the brand of his car, the title on his door. My value, however, was internal, the ability to build, to manage, and to survive. When he stripped me of my status, he forced me to rely on my true value, and that foundation proved to be unshakable. Brian was utterly dependent on his exterior shell. I was now the owner of the shell. My new life wasn't about outspending Brian, it was about outliving his toxicity. I learned to recognize the subtle shift from quiet survival to true, emotional stability. It was in the small things. The new office at Apex Logistics, for instance, was designed with glass walls and transparent partitions, a deliberate contrast to Brian's dark, intimidating mahogany fortress where secrets were buried. We ran the company with complete financial transparency, something Brian would never have dared. One day, I implemented a new policy, the Walker Rule. It was a simple, internal directive that every driver and warehouse worker received a small, guaranteed bonus for delivering shipments on time and without damages, regardless of the company's quarterly fluctuations. It was my quiet, internal mechanism for ensuring that honest hard work was always rewarded first, correcting the decade of Brian's neglect. As Apex Logistics thrived, my personal life began to bloom with a soft, steady light, not the blinding, high-beam intensity Brian demanded. I met Charles, a retired engineer who volunteered at James's school. Charles was the antithesis of Brian. He was quiet, consistent, and genuinely interested in my ideas, not my title. He didn't ask about the company stock or my net worth. He asked about my favorite book and how James's math homework was going. Our relationship was built on the slow, meticulous process of rebuilding trust. I would share a detail from my past, the time I found the crumpled email, the shame of cleaning offices, and Charles would simply listen, never offering judgment, only steady support. I remember once, James was upset because a friend at school had bragged about his father's new, fast car. James asked, "Mom, why don't we have a big, fast car like that?" I paused, thinking about Brian's expensive, reckless car that Lily eventually drove away with. "We could, sweetheart," I told James, kneeling down, "but our family doesn't spend money on speed and show. We spend money on safety and time. Our car is reliable, and the money we save goes into making sure we never, ever have to move in a rush again." James nodded, understanding the quiet significance. He knew our story, not the legal details, but the emotional truth of the betrayal and the fight. He was the most profound measure of my success. The boy who was afraid to ask why we couldn't go home was now a secure, confident child thriving in his environment. The sensory memories of the betrayal slowly lost their power. I no longer smelled that cloying lilac perfume when I was stressed. Instead, my home smelled of the fresh bread Charles baked and the faint, sweet scent of the basil I grew on my windowsill. The constant background anxiety that used to feel like a high-pitched whine was replaced by the comforting, rhythmic sound of the trucks leaving the Apex yard early in the morning, a sound of honest work and reliable income. I had been thrown out on the street to die of hunger, but the experience taught me how to cultivate my own nourishment. I learned that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is allow her identity, her income, and her knowledge to be completely subsumed by a man's ego. Brian, in his attempts to destroy me, forced me to confront and master my true, innate power, the strategic mind that could build an empire from scratch. He thought he was locking me out. He was actually locking me into my destiny. His ultimate failure was complete. He had lost the company, his wife, his mistress, and his reputation. But his deepest, most profound loss was the destruction of the illusion of his own competence. He was, and always would be, merely a face. I was, and always would be, the structure beneath. And that, my dear friends, is the difference between status and value. One is borrowed, the other is earned, and it can never be taken away. The greatest testament to my victory wasn't the acquisition, that was just the paperwork. The true, enduring victory was the complete, ethical transformation of Apex Logistics, a process that continues to this day, years after Brian's humiliation. Brian's company was built on the logic of fear. Fear of being fired, fear of being caught, fear of financial ruin. He squeezed every dollar, believing that greed was the only reliable motivator. I dismantled that logic and replaced it with the logic of kindness, which I had learned in the most difficult classroom, Maria's couch. I realized that kindness in business isn't weakness, it's the ultimate logistical efficiency. When drivers felt respected, they didn't push dangerous schedules, maintenance was reported proactively, and turnover plummeted. This trust directly translated into reliable delivery times, less inventory loss, and ultimately, higher profitability than Brian's reckless fear-based model ever achieved. We were not only more profitable, we were safer and happier. I made 2 non-negotiable cultural changes at Apex. The open door policy. Unlike Brian's closed-off mahogany fortress, my office door remained literally open. Not as a symbol, but as a practical mandate. If a dispatcher or a driver needed to talk about a systemic bottleneck or a personal problem impacting their work, they could walk right in. This transparency meant I caught small problems before they became catastrophic failures, a key difference from Brian, who only saw problems when they were too big to hide. The anti-arrogance clause. We instituted an annual survey, completely anonymous, where employees could rate management on ethics, transparency, and respect. Any manager who consistently scored low was immediately put on review, regardless of their sales numbers. I ensured that the arrogance that destroyed Brian could never take root in my company. This environment attracted the best talent in the region, the reliable, honest professionals who were tired of the macho culture of the old transportation industry. Apex Logistics became a place where competence was celebrated and character was valued over cash. As James grew older, he often asked me about the moral weight of what I did. He didn't ask if I was right to take the company, he asked if I ever regretted the sheer effort it took. "Mom," he asked one afternoon, now a tall, thoughtful teenager, "was it worth spending all those years just focused on fighting him, on getting the company back?" I leaned back, holding a warm mug of tea. "That's an important question, James, and the answer is complex. I didn't spend those years fighting him. I spent them fighting the prophecy he tried to impose on us. I wasn't fighting for the company, I was fighting for choice. And yes, that choice was worth every minute." I explained that the moment Brian threw me out, he forced me to confront a moral dilemma that women face daily. Do you accept the role of the victim because it's easier, or do you accept the burden of the warrior because it secures your freedom? I chose the warrior path, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I realized that true power isn't about crushing your enemy, it's about making your enemy irrelevant. By building Apex, I didn't just survive, I rendered Brian's entire existence, his judgment, his approval, his curse, meaningless. The most profound psychological healing came from recognizing that Brian's betrayal was a gift. It stripped away all the comfortable illusions I had hidden behind. The illusion that a title equals security, the illusion that love guarantees fidelity, and the illusion that my hard work would automatically be credited. I was forced to become my own security system, my own credit line, and my own CEO. And once you realize you can do that, the fear of losing anything external, a house, a job, a partner, loses its paralyzing grip. You become indestructible. I often thought about that first small, white truck, the little engine, that I bought from Brian's discarded assets. It was old, noisy, and inefficient, but it was mine, and it was the first thing that earned an honest dollar for James and me. Apex Logistics eventually retired the little engine, but I kept it. It now sits in the corner of one of our main regional warehouses, polished, carefully maintained, and enshrined as a symbol of the company's foundation. Every new hire, especially those coming through the Sarah Walker Logistics Scholarship, is taken to see it. The plaque on the truck doesn't mention Brian. It simply reads, "The Little Engine." This vehicle represents the belief that all large journeys begin with a single, honest effort. Its job was to carry a small, desperate family from the cold street to the head of the industry. It proves that the most valuable asset is not the machine, but the mind and character that drives it. Apex Logistics, built on competence. That truck is my final, quiet message to the world, and to Brian, who will never see it but will always feel the weight of its success. I never needed his money, his status, or his permission. I had the competence, the love for my son, and the strength of character forged on the night he slammed the door in my face. I didn't die of hunger. I simply built my own, far superior table, and now I invite everyone who was underestimated to take a seat. My dear friends, when I look back at the day Brian threw those $400 at my feet, telling me my son and I would starve, I realize he handed me the most valuable tool of all: motivation wrapped in pure, unadulterated injustice. We often stay in situations that diminish us because we are terrified of the unknown, terrified of the financial chaos, terrified of that first night on the couch, terrified of that fear of hunger. But I am here to tell you that the very fear they weaponize against you is the energy you need to build the strongest foundation of your life. Brian and Lily taught me that status is fragile, but competence is bulletproof. They taught me that the person who looks down on your quiet, meticulous work is the person who is most dependent on it. They saw an empty woman. I became the CEO. If you are currently feeling dismissed, underestimated, or told you are good for nothing, take that injustice, hold it tight, and let it fuel your purpose. You have a skill, a competence, a sheer will to survive that no one, no matter how arrogant, can ever take away from you. They can lock the door on the house, but they can never lock the door on your mind. And when you finally build your foundation, your greatest victory will be the quiet, undeniable hum of your own self-made life. So I ask you today, my dear friends, what is the deepest skill or talent you have that a dismissive person is currently underestimating? It is time to reclaim it. Thank you for letting me share my journey from that cold street to the head of the boardroom table. If this story helped you see your own strength, please subscribe to my channel for more authentic, real-life stories like this one every week. Don't forget to like this video and comment below with your thoughts. Tell me, what is the one thing you're currently building that no one can ever take away from you? I read every comment, and your stories fuel this community. Until next time, be safe, be smart, and build your foundation. Thank you for listening to my story. If you connected with the lessons of resilience and quiet strength in this video, please subscribe to my channel for more authentic, real-life stories like this one every week. Don't forget to like this video and comment below with your thoughts. Tell me, what is the one thing you are currently building that no one can ever take away from you? I read every comment, and your stories fuel this community.